All right, I'm allegedly live again with part 2 of the collision lecture. I'll just wait a few moments for people to arrive, and I'll have a little look on the chat thing as well, see what's going on. Okay, someone's copied the link onto the IRC channel for me. It's very nice of them. Dum, dum, dum. If you're looking on the Facebook page, it looks like the link to part 2 might not be showing as the head item. It's one down because of, Facebook's famous sorting algorithms. Right. Okay, I appear to have 0 viewers on the new stream. That isn't a good sign. Is anybody with me on the new stream? Okay, 6 viewers now. Okay, people are hopefully migrating across. And of course they can't hear me unless they're here. Why did I even ask that, for fuck's sake? Okay. So I'm just going to wait a little bit longer for people to get in, because I just think that not all of you have got across yet, and you might be you might be lagged and stuff like that. I have to make allowances for it. Meanwhile, I've got this other computer that I'm using to monitor things. Let me see if I can get into that. Okay, so the stream is at least up. Okay. All right, I'll take it from there. It's also possible that some of you have had enough. Right, let's continue with part 2 of the exciting collision lectures. So I've described some things. I've described how to do the basic geometry of overlap between your primitives. The question I'm asking is that sufficient to implement a collision detection system? And well, there's clearly a trick in the question and the fact that there's a whole other lecture left. So no, it's not sufficient. In principle, it might be enough to just define boxes and circles and wrap up your entities in them and then detect the collisions. In practice, not necessarily so. One big mistake or limitation we've had so far is we've been thinking about static overlap, which is to say we just look at the position of the entity that the entity ends up in and tries to work out, is that position coincident with someone else? But that's not always the whole story. So it's not sufficient. And that's because there's this thing called dynamic collision. If you've got one object that's moving sufficiently fast, between computing one frame, if you like, one update and the next, it might actually move from being on one side of an object to the other side. For example, you've got like a thin wall and someone running very fast, then they might theoretically move from being on one side of the wall to the other straight away. And neither of those positions would be colliding with the wall. They would just warp through it. They would kind of quantum tunnel through it. And a static collision detection system, one that simply checks for overlap of final positions, would not spot that. And that would be a problem. Indeed, it's such a problem that there's a name for it. It's called the bullet through paper problem, for reasons that are hopefully understandable. This is because it's particularly common with bullets, because bullets are a nasty case for collision systems because they move very fast and they're very small. And it turns out that things that move very fast compared to their own size are the ones that are most likely to have this problem where they can just jump from one side of an object to another and get this tunneling behavior. So we have to deal with that, or at least be conscious of it. So the truth of it is that you shouldn't really be just checking against the static positions of things. You should in fact be checking the swept volumes or areas that an object goes through over time. So that's the whole sweep through space that an object moves through is what you should really be collision checking with. But it turns out that's really hard because the swept forms of geometry become really difficult. The simplest case is the circle. And if you imagine a circle being swept through time, it ends up being a kind of sausage shape thing. It's kind of circular at the ends and a tube in the middle. It's sometimes called a capsule or a lozenge. And it's a geometrically harder thing to think about than a circle. Sweeping a rectangle, okay, if you just translate a rectangle, you kind of get a sort of weird square-edged sausage thing. You can just imagine in your head what it would look like. Until you start thinking about rotations, at which point it just becomes horrible. Imagine if you've got rotating rectangles that are, which of course you've got in things like a spaceship game. Your spaceship might have rectangle collision, but it's also can rotate as it does in asteroids. Then you have this horrible thing where you've got a rectangle translating and rotating through space, and it produces like a big swirly mess. And a big swirly mess is not a well-known geometric primitive for which there are easy equations to solve. If you really had to, sometimes you can actually collision detect against these sort of shapes, but often you can't. Often it's really hard or impractical or slow. So again, we take shortcuts, we cheat, we approximate. One of the standard cheats for this is to use multi-step motion. So the idea there is that rather than computing the full swept volume, which is hard, you simply take snapshots of the object over time as it's moving from where it was to where it wants to be. And instead of just comparing the old position and the new position, you also compare some intermediate positions along the way. And if you do enough of those to fill up the gaps in the motion, you get a sort of acceptable, solid result. So how many steps do you need? Well, you can figure out that from geometric considerations, which is where you make sure that each step is not more than your own radius, as it were, so that there's always just a little bit of a connection between each of the multi-steps are slightly overlapping with each other. Or you can use time-based considerations, where you just say something like, never move by more than some small fraction of time in a single step. So what would happen there is if your update rate was like 16 milliseconds, but you decided that your collision system only works well if things are moving at in jumps of like less than 10 milliseconds, you would simply have to take multiple sub-steps within a single update. And this is often done inside real physics systems. They'll, your game might be running supposedly at 60 hertz with a 16 millisecond update interval, but behind the scenes, the physics system is working on a finer grain. It's maybe running at a millisecond or two of granularity. So it would be making, maybe 8 little sub-steps inside each frame in order to keep the accuracy of the physics system high. There are other approaches. One is if you simply have a known maximum velocity for your object, and that velocity is comparable to its own size, then you wouldn't need to do multiple steps. And or if it's like a small multiple, then you know how many sub-steps you need. If the velocity is never more than twice the radius, then you're never going to need more than 2 sub-steps to do the computation, sort of. And what's often the simplest is to arrange it so that you can just do it in 1 step. So you just cap the velocities of things to be compatible with their actual sizes, which works for a lot of things. Like you take a big thing like a car, the velocity of the car relative to its own size is such that you don't tend to get cars instantly driving through walls in games because the car can't move that much of its own length in a single frame. So in many cases this is fine, and it means that we can sort of ignore the bullet through paper scenario for those cases. It's important to know about it though, and to realise that when things go wrong, that might be why they're going wrong. Sometimes you have to take special care, but often it works with some reasonable checks and balances, as long as you allow for it. But it doesn't work with bullets, right? Bullets really are the hard case here. You can't constrain a bullet to never move more than its own length per frame, otherwise you'd have a remarkably slow-moving bullet. So you have to do something special. But because bullets have the nightmare scenario, they're very small and they're very fast, but here's where you can use it to your advantage. They're so small that you can almost think of them as points. Therefore, the swept volume of a point is just a line. So what it means, the long and the short of it, is that when you're collision detecting against bullets, you actually collision detect against the line between the old and the new positions. So you use that instead. And it turns out that line collision, or like checking line intersections, is something you need anyway. You would use it for bullet collision, but you'd also use it for visibility detection. If you're working out if there's a line of sight between 2 things, which your AI will often need, then what the AI is doing is it's taking an invisible line from its eye to some object, and it's saying, does that line collide with anything? And if you have object picking, where you click on a thing on the screen in 3D and it picks it up, well, what's happened there is that you've drawn a line kind of out of your player's eye into the world through the screen, and you check what that collides with in order to work out if you can pick something up. So it turns out you need line collision, and it's not terribly hard to do, and that's what you use for bullets. Right, let's talk a bit about 3D. So in 3D, the standard primitives that we work with are, as it says there, cuboids, spheres, convex hulls, which I've mentioned but might need to explain them a bit, and some other things, including cylinders and triangles. Now, I happen to know from past experience that some Icelanders didn't know what cylinder means. I guess it's one of the more obscure words. So the cylinder is what you get if you have a bunch of circular coins and you stack them on top of each other, and you get a column of circles, or a Pringles tube. That's a cylinder. I believe the Icelandic word might be silningar or stroka. Those seem to be the 2 translations I'm given, but that's probably terribly wrong, and you're all probably laughing at me right now. But so that's, anyway, cylinder. Try and remember what that is. The cuboids and the spheres are just the natural extension of rectangles and circles. You just add another, add the Z dimension to them, and most of the rest of it is simple. And it turns out that although in a game there aren't that many objects that are naturally and entirely spherical, it turns out to be very common to pretend that they are for collision purposes. The very standard technique is to wrap up arbitrary objects in a bunch of spheres, because it works quite well, because spheres are fast and easy to do collision checks with. And someone's just telling me what a cylinder is on the chat. So let me see. So yeah, back when I was making Wild Metal Country in the late 90s, we had a lot of kind of tanks and stuff in the game, and of course tanks are big, boxy, rectangular things primarily, but we represented them as spheres because spheres were fast to collision check with. So what we do is we just package a bunch of spheres tightly together, almost like in a kind of an egg carton thing, where you've got a lot of spheres in a small space, and use that. And it turns out EVE Online does the same thing. To this day, the collision detection in Eve is based on taking all those spaceships that are all big, long, sleek, angular things and wrapping them up with spheres, which is, you know, it's actually a bit dodgy if you think about it. And indeed, it's something that we might improve eventually if we wanted to have closer ship-to-ship interaction. It might be nice to have a more precise collision volume than a series of sphere approximations. But now you know, and now everyone knows. Okay, triangles. So triangles are another standard primitive, of course, in 3D. They're very popular. It's obviously what most 3D models are made from. And if you don't know, the reason that triangles are used, the reason they're so popular, is that, first of all, you can make anything out of triangles if you have enough of them and they're small enough. And also, a triangle is the simplest 3D shape that you can have, and it's got some nice properties. It's planar, so a triangle is always flat, and it's convex. You know, if you allowed a four-sided shape to exist, the problem is if you take any 4 points and try and join them into a shape in 3D, it's called a quad. The problem is a quad isn't necessarily flat, which makes it very difficult to do geometry with. It's hard to, it's actually ambiguous what the volume of a quad is. So that's why triangles turn out to be good. Unfortunately, they're quite bad for collision. Doing collision at the triangle level is geometrically, it's not super hard, but it is a bit annoying. You know, there are lots of little subtleties about it. So generally speaking, for collision purposes, we don't use triangles, even though they're what you use for rendering stuff with. But they are sometimes used for the environments, static environments and terrains, because nothing else would do as good a job. You know, ordinary game entities, spheres and boxes, approximate them reasonably well, but for your terrain or for a dungeon, it's hard to see how you can beat triangles. So in those cases, we still use them. Or, you know, or planes, but a plane and a triangle are closely related. We also have convex hulls. So a convex hull is the type of shape that's got no concavities in it. You know, in the sense that a cave has got a concavity, it bends in. Convex shapes don't bend in on themselves like that. They're what you would get if you shrink wrapped something, or you know, or inflated something. So they don't have internal recesses, and it turns out that makes them mathematically easier to deal with in various ways. So they're popular for collision. The important thing about a convex hull, which is a, you know, it's a big, like a, you imagine like a die, you know, all the different dice shapes that you get, like, you know, 12-sided, 20-sided dice, these kind of things, they're all convex hulls. They don't have to be as regular as that. It's just any kind of closed mesh like that. They have the nice property that a point is only inside a convex hull if it's on the inner side of all the bounding planes. And I actually spoke about this a little in one of the tutorials, I think. And it just turns out this makes for a fairly good collision detection algorithm. And this is so useful that in games, if you ever have a non-convex thing, the collision system is usually set up to break up the concave object into multiple smaller convex objects so that the collision routine can say everything is convex. People often turn up in computer games, and we have to represent them with collision volumes of some kind. Lots of ways to do it. Well, a couple anyway. A set of spheres is often quite good. You know, like a snowman, you just have like 3 or 4 spheres stacked on each other. It roughly approximates a human. But another common choice is an upright cylinder. So yeah, that's used quite a lot. In fact, Unreal does it that way. The characters in Unreal are, the collision detection is based on a cylindrical tube that's wrapped around the character. So it's not very precise, but it's relatively fast. Now we have to talk about these hierarchies. And I'll just Need a little bit more drink. So another property of 3D models is they're often represented as hierarchies with movable joints. You imagine a humanoid character, they can obviously move their arms and legs. And if you think of like a tank or a car, it's got, cars have got doors that can open and close, tanks have got turrets that can spin around. So you have all these movable parts in a family, and that family's a hierarchy. And that makes collision detection harder as well, because now the collision volume isn't a fixed thing. It has to change its shape as the underlying object changes its shape. Now, sometimes this just works for free. You divide your object up into parts, and those parts have got their own collision volumes on them. And when the parts move around, when you animate the skeleton, the underlying collision volumes all animate as well, and things just work out okay, but not always. Sometimes you have a collision primitive that might cover multiple parts of the skeleton, and things can go wrong with maintaining the correctness there. The other thing that can happen is that if you imagine a fairly tight bounding volume around, let's say, a humanoid or something, like a cylinder, enclosing them, that works most of the time, unless and until they stretch out their arms and their legs at full extent, at which point they don't fit within that volume anymore. So in cases where that's possible, you sometimes have to recompute the parent bounding volume so that it actually matches the position of the object that's inside it at all times. And that's a bit of a pain. Luckily, you don't often have to do it, because although humans can spread their limbs out, they don't usually, unless they're in the throes of death, at which point you're using ragdolls instead. But sometimes you have to do this. The alternative would be just to make sure that the bounding volume is generous and is enough to encapsulate the object no matter which pose it's in. All right. So environment collision, yet another special case, the terrains and the dungeons and so on. It's hard because we can't use spheres for it. And it's also annoying because it's quite frequent. If you imagine a game where you're out running on a terrain, you're colliding with the terrain almost all the time. Whereas ordinary collisions are relatively rare. You don't usually collide with another game entity on every frame. So it's performance sensitive, but it's not incredibly performance sensitive. But if you're colliding with the terrain every frame, that starts to matter a lot. And it's annoying because your terrain is probably made up of triangles, which are slow to collision check against. So this can sometimes be a performance bottleneck. Yeah, an obvious example of that would be if you're driving a vehicle over the ground, then sort of the vehicle is in constant collision with the ground, and that's can be expensive. Turns out in practice there are cheats that are used, guess what, to kind of work around that. A lot of vehicles aren't really colliding with the ground, they're hovering above it. So they actually just, they detect the distance between themselves and the ground, and they adjust their wheel springs so that they're just above the ground, which is a little bit cheaper than actually colliding with it. But nevertheless, the underlying shape that you're floating on is a big triangle mesh. So it is quite a difficult problem, at least in the general case. But there's a particular cheat that's sometimes used for terrains, and that's called a height map. So what you do there is, instead of having the terrain be an arbitrary collection of polygons, which just could be anything, you restrict it to operate on a regular grid. So you have like a 2D array, and the things you store in that array are height values. So you create a kind of gridded tablecloth with heights on it, and you use that as your terrain geometry. That turns out to be a lot easier because of the regularity of the grid. And it's quite memory efficient as well, because you don't need to store the full details of all your vertices. You only need to store the heights, because the other two dimensions are implicit. So basically it's the same trick as we used in Breakout. You use a 2D grid, and the structure of the grid does a lot of the work for you, and all you have to store is a very simple value indicating the height each position on this big grid. And sure enough, that's what we had to do back then as well. And actually Skyrim does this. I was kind of surprised to see it, because this is a bit of an old-fashioned technique. It has virtues, but of course it constrains you to a slightly kind of rigid terrain layout. But Skyrim does it and gets away with it with really good art and level design. They managed to conceal the fact that it's a grid relatively well. I thought I had to look at it carefully before I realised that it was. So how do you make these height maps? Well, lots of things you can do. You could generate them as fractals. It might mean something to some of you. Or you could get the artist to draw them as grayscale textures and then use the value. So they create like a black and white picture. And if it's very white, that's very high up. And if it's very black, that's very low down. So they can just kind of paint a black and white kind of blot in Photoshop or something. And you can turn that into a bunch of height contours. Or you could have tools that actually let you edit the terrain and loft it up and pull these vertices around and shape them a little bit. And in fact, for Wild Metal, we did all three of those things and used them in combination. This isn't about collision detection so much, but as we're talking about height maps, the other thing you have to do with a height map is texture it with some terrain images. And the way that's normally done is you have just a set of pre-rendered terrain tiles that your artists make, representing the various surface types of your world and sometimes the combinations of those surface types. And you just kind of stamp those across your height map. If you're lucky and you've got good texture blending, you can also use that to try and smooth the joins between what would otherwise be very angular looking tiles between different surface types. Now, back in the late 90s, that kind of texture blending was not readily available. 3D accelerator hardware was not universal, and if you try to do it in software, it's very slow. So we couldn't do the texture blending trick. Instead, we had to have pre-authored blends that the artist would make, and we would do a kind of best fit thing to work out which pre-computed blend to use on each tile to try and make the map look decent. So here it is. So this is a game where the environment, as you can perhaps see, these sort of lines are kind of giving it away. The environment is like a big regular grid with height values on it, painted with textures that have come from a tile set created by our wonderful artists, having to work with quite limited colour palettes and a limited amount of texture memory. And we've got moving objects like this tank here that's actually represented as a bunch of spheres. And we've got some things being shot over here that are represented as, guess what, spheres. And if you play it now, you might have a sense of what's actually happening here under the hood. One funny little thing, in the front end of the game, we show the environment with this sort of Tron-like kind of highlighted grid thing. This is exactly the same rendering system as is used in game. It's just that we change all the textures to just being a texture with a luminous border and a black center. So it looks like it's a kind of glowing wireframe, but it's not really. It's actually a solid terrain render. Okay, let's get in. Nice little particle system there. So you see, he's colliding with the terrain all the time, but it's relatively fast to compute it, because all you have to do is say, let's assume that the XY coordinates are the ground and the Z is the height. So you just say, I know my XY coordinates, so they tell me where I am in the 2D array, and you can just go into the 2D array and find the appropriate height values that are around you, and then you just do a kind of linear blend to work out the exact height underneath you. And each of the wheels basically drops a perpendicular ray to find out how high it is above the ground. And then the physics system is sort of spring-based, and it tries to adjust those undulations and creates corresponding forces on the wheels so that the object kind of appears to drive over the surface. See that dynamic glow there as well? That's a relatively early example of dynamic lighting, which is also a complete cheat because you couldn't afford real dynamic lights back then. So what's happening here is this thing is just drawing a big circle onto the terrain map and setting the colour of the vertices on the terrains. So it becomes a very simple circle drawing routine, and the idea is the terrain picks up that colour value from the fake light and passes it on to all the objects that are on that part of the terrain. Not sure if you fully understand the details of that, but it gives you cheap dynamic lights. So with vistas like this, you can definitely see that it's a kind of grid system, although we've done our best to create blends to sort of make it look smooth. If you go and look at Skyrim, they do it a lot better, but that's because they've got real texture blending and a lot more texture memory to throw at the problem. So that's one of the reasons that looks nicer. It's collisions taking place there. Look, collisions. Yeah, just incidentally, I'll mention these particles, as you can see, are just little sort of solid rectangles, very similar to what Quake did, which was about the same time. And this is because this whole thing is being drawn in software by the CPU. We had a version, the game could run on the early 3D accelerators, which could do alpha blending, so they could make explosions look kind of smooth, the way they would in a modern game. But the software rendering, it was very slow to do that. So in software, we use these little opaque things instead to approximate it. So this has actually been, all this 3D rendering has been done by the CPU, which, by the way, would have been running at about 90 or maybe 133 megahertz back in the day. I was just hoping that there would be an explosion sometime soon. We could see something blowing up. Maybe not. Okay, we'll leave it at that. I guess you can look at it in your own time if you care that much. Right. And here's the Skyrim equivalent. Like, you know, what, nearly 15 years later. So this is their editor, which is not a million miles away from the one that we had. Okay, any moment now we'll do something interesting. Should I fast forward it a bit? Perhaps I should. Now we're going to see it. Okay, he's about to do some stuff. Yeah, okay, make some terrain, please. All right, okay, I will fast forward. Okay, here we get to the bit where he's painting some terrain on the grid. So that's him painting water, and you can see the tile boundaries here. But they're also doing some quite nice effects on the water rendering. So this is how you paint a surface over the grid. And some different stuff over here. And then you start actually lofting it. So you start pulling up or flattening the terrain and changing the height values to build the topography of your world. There we go, pulling up a big hill. So again, this is very similar to the kind of stuff that we did back in the day. Yeah, so it's all this kind of thing, lofting and painting and spraying textures onto it to make it look nice. Can be quite a kind of intricate process to make it look good. And then here are some examples of the kind of terrain textures you might have that you would then paint all over the resulting grids. And of course, if you could blend between them, you could make the transitions look smoother. So that's sort of how all that is done. Again, the real relevance for the point of view of collision is just the idea that by having it all in a regular 2D grid, it makes the computing the height at any point very fast. And that allows you to do your large number of collision checks per frame in a relatively efficient manner. So that was 3D. In 2D environment collision, if you got something like a platform game, which is the kind of thing you'd be capable of doing by now, I think, it's sort of equivalent to that. You have your 2D grid becomes the 2D background of your platformer that we discussed a while back. And when you're moving a character around, you can take their XY coordinates, work out what position on the 2D background grid that corresponds to, and then look in there to see what type of graphic is in the background. And if it's one of the graphics that's supposed to be solid, you hit it, and if it's not, then you don't. So that's why I did Breakout. One of the good things about Breakout as an exercise is it sort of teaches you this idea of doing fast lookups into 2D grids instead of linearly checking against every possible thing. Yeah, so that's the kind of thing that Mario games would do. All right, so that's we're nearly at the end for today, thank goodness. There's a little bit more to be said though. There's a lecture tomorrow, which hopefully I'll be able to give in person, because doing it this way is weirdly stressful and difficult. There's so many things I'm having to monitor. So tomorrow, hopefully it'll be in the flesh, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you make collision systems that scale to large complex games. But until then, I will leave you with another exciting episode of when things fall over, spill, or get knocked out of cupboards.
Once, I went to a coconut shy to try and knock a coconut off its wooden perch and win a stuffed toy for a lady who had enchanted me. I'm Greg Evigan, Danny Doyle in TV's Masquerade. But no matter how hard my balls battered the nut, it would not fall. That's right. The gypsy who ran the shy had nailed it down, as if to mock both me and gravity. If only it were so easy to escape the consequences of what happens when things fall over, spill, and get knocked out of cupboards. This week, beer. Again.
Well, it was early on a Sunday morning. I put a few beer cans in an old Sainsbury's bag, and my feet led me to the house where I used to live with Margaret. Well, where Margaret still lives. With Carl. Anyway, I looked at the old house, and memories came flooding back, good ones. Days of wine and roses, etc. And when my arm started to shake, it's that old stress thing again, and the beer can just shot out of my hand straight through the windscreen of Carl's car.
That's a collision taking place there.
He's running out of the house. Stop punching.
That's the actor Kevin Eldon.
Tim comes out, he's shouting something at the...
Go away! Come your time!
Dad, go away! We don't need you. And, well, anyway, they don't let me see me. Court thing, Silly, really. A couple of beer cans. Absurd.
say I did not win the stuffed toy. The woman soon left me, and I could only dream of what might have been had nature been allowed to run unfettered. But if only that beer had been nailed down too, then perhaps Peter Gibbs would not have shamed himself so when things fall over, spill, or get knocked out of cupboards. I'm Greg Evigan. See you around, my friends.
I made this. Goodbye.